As a developer, there are key things you need in every project. Authentication, a database, logs, perhaps a place to store images, and all the security that surrounds all of that. Well, Supabase gives you all of this really fast. In this video, we're going to be doing three things. One, we'll be going over what Supabase is and why you should try it out. Two, a small demo on how to read and write to the database. And then lastly, three, add Supabase to a full stack project to see how quickly it can be implemented with real life use cases. If you're new to the channel, I'm Eric Roby, a software engineer with over a decade of experience, and I've helped thousands of developers learn and grow within their craft. So I tried Supabase a while ago and I liked it a lot. Supabase is an open source platform that provides developers with the backend services they need to use to build a modern application. This means it gives you the authentication, the database, the logs, and all that kind of stuff right out of the box. Supabase does offer API endpoints and something called edge functions for front-end developers to have access to the backend, but I still prefer to use my own backend language in Python and then connect Supabase to my Python project as an SDK. This flow gives me a better control over all the business logic, and that's what we're going to be going over in this video. Well, what I'm always impressed about when using Supabase is the ease of creating authentication and database tables and then implementing it within my own project. I like this so much that I'll probably be using Supabase on many of my side projects in the future just because of how easy it is to do some of the hard things or the things that take a while to implement. So as a visual learner myself, I think the best way to learn how Supabase can be used in your project is by code. So let's go ahead and dive in and go through this tutorial on Supabase. All right, so the very first thing you need to do is head over to supabase.com, and then from here you can create an account. It's very easy. You can sign up with your email or different kind of authentication options. And then once you're signed up, you're going to be brought to your dashboard. Now, I already have my organization as Coding with Roby. I already have one demo project. So let's go ahead and just create another project. And I'm going to do this by saying new project, and I'm going to select the Coding with Roby organization. Now, inside of here, we can see the organizations, Coding with Roby. We need to create a project name. I'm going to say YouTube Demo. And then you need a database password. Just type in whatever you want as your database password. And then for your region, if you open this up, there's a couple different countries to select from. I'm going to say US East Ohio because that's closest to my location, but select whatever location is closest to you. If you open up security options, you can see that there's going to be a couple different security options. Leave that all default and then say create new project. This will just take a few moments and I'll be back to the video once this is complete. All right, so the project was completed. We can see that it's going to be our YouTube demo. It's going to be on their nano compute size. And if we scroll down, we can see our project URL and our API key. Now, if we want a API key that kind of bypasses RLS, we can just click this one. But let's go to our project real quick. And inside here, I have our employee repository, which I'll get to once we start creating a real project. But for the demo, we just kind of want to go through the basics of Supabase and how we can create and use tables and all that kind of stuff. So to get started, let's go ahead and say pip install Supabase. This will download all the dependencies that you need to be able to use Supabase. And then the very first thing we want to do is say from Supabase, import the create client in the client. And then we want a Supabase URL and a Supabase key. And then after this, we need to initialize our Supabase client. So we can say Supabase of our client equals create client, and we're going to pass in our URL and key. Perfect. And this is how you set up a Supabase environment. And now we just need to add our key and URL. So let's go back in here. Let's go ahead and grab our project URL. And then we want to grab our key. Now for this tutorial, I'm just going to say click here to get our service key. This is going to be a key that allows us to bypass some security measures, but that's okay for this tutorial. And now let's go back in here and let's paste in that security key right here as our Supabase key. Perfect. Now what we need to do is go back into our Supabase And let's go over here and do the very first option, which is table editor. Here, we're going to create a new table by just saying create table. This table is going to be called demo table. And I'm going to remove this RLS, which is row level security, just so we can have a little bit more functionality within our demo. And then we can say save. So by default, we can see that it created our ID and created at. We can click this plus sign to add a new column. I'm just going to say first name. And inside our column type, we are going to call this a text. And then we can say save. So now our table of demo table is going to have an ID, created at, and first name. Now the ID and created at is going to be auto-populated by the table, while our first name is what we're going to have to pass in. So if we go back into our code right here, we can select all the tables from our application by saying results equal supabase.table, where we name this table demo-table, where we now need to write the SQL query. So we can say .select star .execute, and then we can just print the results that we get back. Now, if we run this application, I'm going to say Python 3 demo.py. We can see that it did connect to our database. We just have no items inside our database. So if we go in here and we want to add data, just to start it off, we can say insert a new row where the ID is going to be automatically generated. The created at is going to be automatically generated. And then for the first name, I'm just going to say Eric to kick this off. If we save, we can see that we get a new record inside our database. And now inside here, if we rerun our application, we can see that we're going to get one item of data, which is ID of 1, created at our current timestamp, and then first name is Eric. Real quick, if you've enjoyed the video, please subscribe to be notified of upcoming videos. And check out my best-selling FastAPI course linked below. So that's perfect. This is all you got to do to be able to retrieve all records inside a table. Well, now if we want to insert a new row into our table, we can just say new row equals, and then we can create a dictionary of the items that are not going to be auto-populated by the database, which is going to be the first name. Where we can just say first name of type first name, which is going to be John Doe. And then we want to say supabase.table of our demo table. And now we're going to say insert our new row.execute. Perfect. So if we run our application now, we can see that there's going to be a new item that gets inserted, and then we're going to retrieve all of the information from our database again. So we can see there's going to be an ID of 1, which is Eric, and then an ID of 2, which is John Doe. Perfect. So that's how you easily insert items into a Supabase database. Now, let's say we wanted to update our John Doe and maybe make it like Jane Doe. Well, we can do something very similar to how we did this new row, where we're going to say first name is now going to be Jane Doe instead of John Doe. And now inside here, we're going to say supabase.table and then pass in our demo table. And we're going to say .update our updated row only when the ID is equal to 2. And that's because we know that John is the second ID. So this .equal is a way for us to be able to find the filter. So we can say we can filter on ID where 2 is. So now if we run the application, we can see that John Doe is now going to be Jane Doe under the ID of 2. Now let's just say we want to delete the second ID altogether. So this one is update. And now let's say we want to delete a record. Now it's going to be very similar. Again, we're just going to say supabase.table, demo table, and we're going to delete where the equal ID is 2.execute. And now if we run our application, we can see that we're only going to get one object back again. And that's because we just deleted that from the database. So this is how you can easily get all CRUD operations in Supabase using their table. And we can fetch by specific objects by using this equal to. So instead of saying select all, we would say select, and then where the equal ID is equal to whatever item we're trying to fetch. Now, there's really one more thing that we'd want to do here, and that's if we want to render a photo. And I kind of want to show how that works before we dive into the project. So let's say we wanted to implement a photo. So what we can do is let's go back into our Supabase. And not inside our table, but inside storage is where we can save objects. So kind of think of it like an AWS S3 if you understand like kind of object storage. But here we can create buckets and store digital content. So if we're inside here, we can say new bucket, and inside this bucket, we can name it whatever we want. So I'm going to name this demo bucket. And inside here, make sure you make your bucket public. And that's because it'll allow anyone to be able to read the object without authorization. So if we say save here, we now have our demo bucket that's ready to drop any kind of objects inside. So let's start by just dropping in a single image. So I'm going to grab image 1 and drop it inside here. So this is going to be uploading an image. It's of a developer coding. I have 3 different images for this video, but if we open this up, we can see that the image is right here. So how this works is we're going to be getting a URL, and inside the URL, we will be able to fetch this object directly. And this is the most popular way to be able to handle like images and different types of formats. So we're going to get a image, and then on the UI, we can render that image based on the URL. And we can do this by inside here saying that we want to get a response from supabase.storage.from our demo bucket. Get the public URL, and then we can pass in the image, which is image1.ping. So right here, if we go ahead and we run the application now, we can see that we get a URL back. If we grab this URL and we go back into our browser and we just override this URL with the URL that we just got, we can see that this does bring up this image. And this is the best way, so we don't have to be like pooling images and shipping them over HTTP and all this kind of stuff. We just get the URL, and then from the URL, we can access the image and then, load that on the client browser. So awesome stuff. We just went through some of the basics of Supabase. So now let's go ahead and dive into a real life project. Now, if we open up our employee repository, what we have inside here is a model of employee base. We are going to have a first name, a last name, an email, and a salary on top of the created date and ID inside our Supabase. So we're going to be creating like an employees repository where we're going to be using Pydantic as a way to validate and make sure the object is correct. And then inside our main app, we have our FastAPI ready to go with a static CSS directory and then our HTML templates using Jinja. And then we're implementing our employee routers. And this is because we haven't yet done authentication, and we're going to add that here as well. And then we have our forms, which is a decorator that adds an asForm class method on our Pydantic model, which allows us to be able to instantiate the form data submitted via HTTP request. So we're going to submit new employees over a form instead of like an API endpoint. We have our database, which takes in environmental variables, which are very important pieces of information that we're going to need to have here, and it's allow us to deploy without our API endpoints and all that being exposed. We have a quick throw error for environmental error if one of these aren't filled out. And then we have our Supabase client, again, like we had before. So let's start by just filling out our .env, which is our Supabase URL, key, and bucket. And we can get all this right here from our demo, and they're in the exact same spot on our home page. So right here, we know our URL is this. Our key is going to be this. And then our bucket is just going to be demo bucket. And that's the same bucket that we have right here where we are submitting images before. And I'm going to delete that image and then re-upload it as a user in a little bit. All right, perfect stuff. Now, the very first thing that we need to do to get this even working is we need to install FastAPI, Unicorn, Jinja 2, Python multipart, email validator, and python.env. So a lot of things right here. So let's go ahead and say pip install FastAPI, Unicorn, Jinja 2. We'll do that first. And then let's go ahead and say pip install Python multipart and email validator. And then lastly, let's go ahead and say pip install python.env. And I have a lot of these already installed in this environment. Cool. Now what we want to do for this project is let's go back into our Supabase. I'm going to delete this image right here, just so it is deleted to start with. And then what I want to do is come up here to our table editor. All right, and then right here, I'm just going to create a new table. We can keep this table live. I'm going to say new table, and we want this table just to be called employees. And as before, we can go through here and create everything ourselves. Or what we could do instead of doing this is inside our SQL editor, we can write SQL queries right here to automatically create tables or do anything writing raw SQL. And just for an example, I'm going to do this for this video where we can just say create table employees where we have an ID of primary key, first name text, last name text, email is going to be unique. So there can't be two items with the same email. Salary is going to be numeric, image URL text, and is active. And we're going to say default is true. So when we delete a user, we're just going to change that activity to false instead of true. So we still have a record of all users in our database. If you click run, it's going to run, success, no errors. And if we go back to our table editor, we can see our employees is right here with everything right here. Awesome stuff. Now, after doing this, let's go back into our VS Code and kind of just see what's going on our routes inside our employee routes. Well, nothing's going on, right? We have our static, which is our CSS to make it all look nice. And then we have some HTML templates for adding an employee and editing an employee, but we have nothing in our routes. So if we try to run the application right now, it's probably going to break because inside here, we're expecting a routes from router of employee router, and we have nothing inside here right now. So to start, we need to add some imports. So right here, we have our FastAPI, which is an API router, request depends, and our file uploads. And then we have our database with some other information. After this, we are going to want to add our models, our forms, and our FastAPI templating from our Jinja 2. And we can just go ahead and start this router by saying router equals API router. And then our templates is going to redirect us to our employee repo templates, which is our HTML files. Now let's go ahead and just be able to fetch our current employees that are in our database, which does not yet exist as of right now. But what we want to do here is just say @router.get/ with a response class that's equal to HTML response. And then we can say async def read employees where we pass on a request of type request. And then we can say response equals supabase.table, where we say we want to select all from our employees where our users are active. And then we can execute that. And then we can say employees equals our response.data. And then we want to finally return our templates of our template response, which is going to redirect us to our index.html, where we can pass in our request and our employees. We also want the user to be able to get to our add HTML functionality, which is going to redirect us just to our add HTML page. And we can do that by saying @router.get/add, where our response class is equal to HTML response. And then async def add employee form, where we can also again pass in our request. And then we want to say return templates.template response add employee.html request a request. And that's going to redirect us to our add employee.html inside our templates directory. Now, we also want to be able to add an employee by actually adding them to the database instead of just redirecting them to a new page. So right here, we can say @router.post/add, where we say async def add employee, where we need to pass in a request of request, employee, our employee create, which equals our dependency injection of our employee create as form. And then we also might be taking in a image, right? So we want to say image upload file equals file of none. And again, we want the image URL, not the image. So we can say image URL equals none if image and image.filename is not empty, Well, then our image file name equals an F string, our employee.firstname, employee.lastname, and image.filename. Now we want to read the content inside. So we can say file content equals await image.read. This turns the file contents of the image into bytes. And then we can say our response equals supabase.storage.from our Supabase bucket.upload our image file name and our file content. If response.statuscode is equal to 200, well, then we know our image URL is going to be our Supabase URL. At our storage v1 object public at our bucket name / our image file name. And then lastly, we can say supabase.table employees.insert, where we pass in our first name, employee.firstname, last name, employee.lastname, email, employee.email, salary, employee.salary, and then image URL is going to be our image URL. And then we can execute this and then return our redirect response. Of / to our status code of 303. All right, after adding all that, let's go ahead and just try our application just to see if everything's loading or how it's looking. So we can do this by saying unicorn employee _ repo dot main app -- reload. All right, let's grab this URL. And boom, we have image, name, email, salary, and action. If we come over here and say add employee, we can see this add new employee, where I'm just going to say Eric, last name is going to be Roby. I'm going to say eric@email.com, and the salary is going to be 80,000. Here we can say choose file, and I'm just going to select image 3 to start, and then I'm going to say add employee. And boom, we can see that we have our image, we have our name, email, salary, and active. So our image is going to be of our user, Eric, boom, and then we have our actions of edit and deactivate. Now we know our edit and deactivate does not work yet. We're on a good start. So if we say add employee and we just create a new Eric, and I'm just going to say test as the last name. This time we can just say new eric@email.com. And this person is going to have a salary of 75,000. And this image is going to be image 1. Add employee, we can see that it's loading. And then we have our second user right here. So everything is looking good right now. Now, the next thing that we want to do is be able to edit an employee. All right, so now what we need to do is enhance our application to be able to use these edit and deactivate buttons without our application just crashing when clicking on one. So let's go back into our application and let's scroll to our bottom after our last post. Now, what we want to do is when a user goes to that edit page, we don't throw an error, but we return them to our edit.employee.html file, which is also inside our templates. Now, we can do this by saying @router.get/edit/employee-id, where our response class is going to be an HTML response, where our function is going to be async def edit employee dot async def edit employee form, where we pass in request and our employee ID of int. Our response is going to equal supabase.table, where we pass in our employees table dot select all, where our ID is equal to our employee ID, and then we want to execute. And then we can say employee equals response.data 0 if response.data else none. If not employee, return templates.template response error.html, where we're just going to say, hey, our request and our errors is going to be employee not found with a status code of 404. Else, we're just going to return templates.template response of edit employee.html. Where we return our request of request and then our employee of our employee. Now, once you're on this page, we need a way to be able to enhance or update the selected employee. So we can say @router.post/edit/employee ID. Our function is going to be async def edit employee, where we pass in a request of request, employee ID of int. Employee update equals depends of our employee update dot as form, and then our image upload file equals file none. Here we can just copy and paste the same image that we had above, where we're going to be passing in our image URL of none, and then we need to do a couple different things to be able to change our image into bytes and then upload that to our file storage. And then after this, we can say update data equals employee.modelDump. If image of URL, then we want to update our data to our image URL to be our image URL, and then supabase.table employees.update our updated data. Where our ID matches our employee ID, and then execute this. And if successful, we want to redirect the employee back to our home page with a status code of 303. And then lastly, we just have a single button for deactivate. So we can say @router.get/deactivate/employee ID. Where if that happens, we can create a Python function of async def deactivate the employee, where we just pass in the employee ID. And here we can say supabase.table employees.update, where we were going to update our is active to false. Where our IDs match our employee ID, then execute that, then also redirect the employee back to the home page. All right, so after we add all this code, let's go ahead and just rerun our application again. Go back into our project, refresh. We have our 2 users. Let's go ahead and update this first employee by clicking edit. We can see all the information is already added. We'll add a couple Y's at the end. Let's change the image to maybe the second image, and then we can say upload or update employee. And we can see that it was updated. This now has a bunch of Y's at the end, and this one is the image of the new image that we updated. Here, let's do the same thing with this one, but let's just change the salary to maybe like 100,000 just to see what happens. And there we have it. We have it on 100,000 right here. Now, what happens if we just go ahead and deactivate the very first person? Well, that should completely remove them, because when we fetch, we are only looking for active users. So right here, we have a full functioning CRUD application where we can add, update, delete, and fetch. All right, now, one thing that's also really popular is implementing authentication. So let's go ahead and learn how we can implement authentication in Supabase so only select users will have the ability to be able to implement these CRUD operations. All right, so to implement authentication, let's go back into our Supabase URL, our Supabase project, where we can see that we have 2 employees right here inside our table. We're only showing 1 though, because we have is active to false on one of them. All right. So now let's go down to authentication. Now, what we want to do here is let's go ahead and check out the providers. And inside our providers, we have our email, which is enabled, and we can enable a couple different types of authentication here. But let's go inside email. And the very first thing that we want to do is users will need to confirm their email addresses before signing in for the first time. This is good in theory, but not necessarily good in this project since we're making up emails. But then after doing that, that's what we need to do here. Let's make sure you say save. And now that's saved. And now let's go down to URL configuration. And when we scroll down where we see this redirect URLs that auth providers are permitted to redirect to post authentication, let's go ahead and say add a new URL here. And what we want to say is http://localhost port 8000, which is where our application is hosted. And then we want to say wildcard, which means you can go to any of those URLs after that. And then we can say save URL. Now, a way that Supabase protects your authentication is we need to do 2 things. There needs to be a JWT token, a JWT token secret, which we can find inside here. If we scroll down, we can see our API project keys. Take that away. If we come down here and we go to our project settings, and we scroll down inside our API, we can see our JWT secret. We're going to want to make sure we grab that and copy it. Let's go back into here. And what we want to do is go into our env file again. And here, let's create a new one called Supabase JWT secret. And inside here, let's go ahead and just paste in our JWT secret. This is going to be the secret that allows us to be able to prove that we are using a Supabase token when we try to authenticate against it. Perfect. Now, next thing we need to do is do a pip install for PyJWT. This allows us to be able to use JWTs inside of our application. And now let's go into our database.py file. And inside here, we want to say our Supabase JWT secret that we got from right here equals our os.getenv from our Supabase JWT secret. And then also right here, we can just add it in right here to make sure that we are verifying, but we do not need to do anything with our client. All right, now what we want to do is inside our main directory of our employee repository, we want to say create new file and say auth.py. Now this auth.py is going to be our middleware and our get current user dependency injection that we're going to be implementing. So just to get it started with all of our dependencies, we can say FastAPI request HTTP exception status and depends. We will need our HTTP bearer and our HTTP authorization credentials. We need to import our JWT, which is from our PyJWT that we just installed. And then we need to get our Supabase JWT secret from our database. Perfect. Now from here, we want to be able to have a middleware that pulls out the cookie of each request from our Jinja. So we can say async def auth middleware request of request call next. And then token equals request.cookies, and we want to get our access token from our cookies. If token and token dot starts with bear, and JDBT is a bearer token, so it will. Token equals token dot split, and we want to space at 1, which just extracts the actual token. We then want to say request.headers of our dictionary is going to be a list.append. And we just want to append our authorization bearer token and then encode it with base 64. We can then say response equals await call next of our request and then return our response. We then want to be able to get our current user for dependency injection later on. So we can say def get current user. Credentials is going to be our HTTP authorization credentials of our dependency injection of our security that we just implemented above with our HTTP bear. And then we can say try token equals credentials dot credentials. And then we want to remove the bear prefix if present. So we can say if token dot starts with bear, we want to do our token equals token dot split. And then grab the second element, which is the token. Then we want to add options parameter to ignore the audience claim. So we can say payload equals jwt.decode, where we're going to pass in our token, our Supabase JWT secret. Our algorithm for our JWT is going to be HS256, and then our options is to verify audience of false. Our user ID is going to equal our payload, where we're just going to extract the sub, which is going to be the content of our JWT. And then if user ID is none, well, then we want to raise an HTTP exception of a status code equals status.http 401 unauthorized with a detail of invalid authentication credentials, and then return our payload. And then we want to accept conditions. So we can say accept JWT.expired signature code. So if our JWT is expired, we want to raise an HTTP exception of a status code of status.401 unauthorized with a detail of token has expired. And then if we just have an error on our PyJWT, we want to say raise exception of the same exact thing, but could not validate credentials. All right, perfect. Now let's go into our main.py file where we need to up here say .routes, and then we also want to import. And then in here, let's go ahead and right under our templates, we want to implement that middleware that we just added. So what we can do is up here, say from.auth, import our auth middleware. And then right here under our templates, we can say app.middleware, HTTP, and then we're just going to pass in our auth middleware. Perfect. Okay, so now the very last thing we need to do is go ahead and add in our auth router right here in our routes. So let's go ahead and create a new file right here inside our routes, and this is going to be called authroutes.py. All right, and just like before, let's go ahead and just add in the imports that we need to make this work with our directory of our Jinja that goes to our templates. And then inside here, we need to add really like 5 endpoints to that renders pages. So we want our @router.get for our signup and our response class. And then we want signup for actually being able to implement a new user. So right here, let's go ahead and say @router.get/signup, where our response class is going to be HTML response. Async def signup form, which is going to be a request of request, and then we can return our templates.template response. Where we're going to have our signup.html, where we return a request of type request. And then we want signup, which is going to be @router.post/signup. Where we can say async def signup, where we're going to be passing in an email of string, which is going to be of type form. And then password of string, which is going to equal of type form. We can then say try, and here's going to be our first Supabase for signing up authentication, where we can say auth response equals supabase.auth.signup, where we pass in an email and password. If auth response.user is none, well, then we want to raise an HTTP exception of a status code of 400 and a detail of signup failed. And we want to redirect the user back to login with a status code of 303. And then at the end of the try, we want to say accept exception as E, where we can just raise an HTTP exception, status code equals 400 with a detail of string, and we're just going to wrap the error inside. We then want to create a new route API that brings us to the login page. So we can say @router.get/login response class equals HTML response. Async def login form request of request, which returns templates.template response of login.html. Which returns a request of request. And then our login is going to be very similar to our sign up. So we can say @router.post/login, async def login, response of response, email string of form, and then password string of form. We can try again our auth response equals supabase.auth, but this time we're going to say .signin with password. With our email and passwords. If auth response.user is none, well, then we want to raise an HTTP exception with a status code that's equal to 400 and detail login failed. But if it does work, well, then we want to set the token in the cookies. So we can say access token equals auth response.session.access token. Response equals redirect response of / with a status code of 303. Response.setCookie, where our key is going to equal our access token with our value of our bare access token with HTTP only to be true. And then return the response, and then accept exception as E, and then raise HTTP exception status code 400 detail equals string, and we're going to wrap it again in an error. And then our logout functionality is going to be pretty simple with a router.get/logout. Async def logout responsive response. Response equals redirect responsive /login, status code of 303, response.delete cookie, key of our access token, and then return our response. All right, so now that we have all this added, we need to go into our templates and add these login and logout HTML files. So let's go ahead and just say new file. This is going to be login.html. And the other one, I'm sorry, it's not going to be logout, it's going to be sign up. So let's go ahead and say signup.html. Now in our login, we just want to add some code. Again, all this code is available in the repository below. And then in the sign up, we want to do fairly the same thing where we're just going to be adding an email and password for signing up. And then lastly, in our base, in our nav, we're going to add a few more buttons for logging in and logging out. All right. So now we need to do one last thing before our application is ready to go. In our main.py file, we need to come up here and say we also want to add the routes from our auth routes. And then right here where we include our routes, let's go ahead and do this, but we also want to add our auth routes.router. Now let's go into our employee routes. And inside here, we want to say from auth import get current user. And now what we want to do is for this read employees, we just want to add current user of dictionary equals depends of get current user. And this is dependency injection to make sure that our user is authenticated. Now, this will allow us to do a lot of the authentication. So we're just saying, hey, before we run this function, we need to do dependency injection on our authorization for our current user. Now, we're not going to be using our current user, but we need to do this to do authentication. And FastAPI will catch and handle exceptions in behind scenes. So then for adding, we want to do the same thing. We want to do it right here as well for when we add a user. For our edit, we want to implement this. For right here, we want to implement this as well. And then for deactivate, we also want to implement this. So we're implementing it for all of our employee routes. The only thing that's not is our auth routes. And that's because we need those available for users to be able to create their own users. So now if we go back into our application and we open up our repository, if we refresh, we're going to say not authenticated. So we need to go over to our /login, which is only going to have our login and sign up. Well, we see that we're getting an error on sign up, but our login is working fine. So let's go ahead and just see what is going on with our sign up. It's saying it can't find signup.html. So I must have just had a typo in here somewhere. Right here when we fetch the page, that needs to be .html, not .html. So let's go back into our application now, refresh and see if we can go to our sign up page. And we can, so sign up. So for our email, let's go ahead and just say, this is going to be ericroby@email.com. And my password to be able to sign in, I'm going to say sign up. So I'm going to change the email to codingwithroby@gmail.com. And then I'm going to add my own password. And then I'm going to click sign up. Now it brings us to our login page where I'm now going to type in email and password. So it's going to be codingwithroby@gmail.com and then my password that I just created before. And I'm going to input wrong credentials at first. We can see that it brings up an error. And now I'm going to type in the correct password. Well, it looks like we might have got an internal error. So let's go see what's going on. We're getting a request.headers at our dictionary list.append. Let's see where that is. Oh, you know what? It's going to be inside our auth.py. Okay, I see what the issue is. It's because we don't have an underscore in front of list. All right, now let's go back into our application. Let's re-sign in. Boom, we can see that it works, but let's log out and re-sign in again just so we can see the entire flow. So codingwithroby@gmail.com and then our password. Let's go ahead and log in and boom, we're in. Now let's go ahead and create a new employee. So let's go ahead and just name this employee new Eric. Last name is going to be ASD. Let's make it a capital A though. Email asd@test.com. And then for the salary, let's go ahead and say this person's making $1 million. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. So $1 million. Choose file, and we'll use image 1 and say add employee. And boom, we get another error. Well, this time the error is expected. And I just kind of want to walk through in case you have this issue after doing authentication. So what Supabase is trying to do is add some authorization to our storage bucket. And what we need to do is go to our policies and say new policy for full customization. And then right here, we're just going to say allow non-users to upload files. And then we're going to click all of them. So select update, delete. And then as the policy definition, we can remove that and just say auth.role equals anon. This will allow us to now be able to add items to our bucket when a user is authenticated. And now if we go back and we say add new employee and we just type in new Eric, ASD, make the last name capital A, email asd@gmail.com, salary, $1 million, and then we choose the same file image as before and we click add employee. we'll see that everything works. Awesome job. So if you liked this video, please feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next.